Hey friends, it's Marissa here. I don't know if you've heard yet, but we are hosting a retreat this March called Wired. I don't want to spoil any of the surprises, but it's going to be wild. Registration has opened and our team is counting down the days. We can't wait. If you haven't registered yet, the link is in our bio on Instagram or on our website. Now for today, we are in chapter 6 of this story, and my friend Sid is here to take it away.
Hey, have you ever been with someone who has put you in a situation where you wonder if you will ever get out alive? Okay, maybe out alive is a bit extreme. How about out with most of my limbs still connected to my body? Or out with my brain still mostly working? Or out with as many people as we went in with? You know, one of those types of situations, it's the type of situation where you ask questions like, is this wise? Do we have the ability to actually do this? Does my friend even love me? About 2 years ago, Jen, my wife, and I were visiting friends in northern Alberta. When we woke up the second morning, my friend asked if we wanted to go kayaking, and immediately our answer was yes. I mean, this would be fun. You know, my wife and I, we live at Green Bay Bible Camp, and we have these really nice plastic Canadian Tire kayaks that we float on near the shore with families and kids. So of course we were into kayaking. Pretty quickly, I came to the conclusion that my version of kayaking and my friend's version of kayaking were two very different versions. For instance, our kayaks were not plastic Canadian Tire models. They were legitimate, professional, whitewater inflatable kayaks. And we were not simply walking down to the beach to get in the water. We were getting into his helicopter and flying into the middle of nowhere to access a fast-moving whitewater mountain river that he had never been on before. This was a first-time adventure for pretty much all of us. So we landed his chopper on the banks of the river, inflated the kayaks, and within 30 seconds of being on the river, I was fairly convinced at least one of us had a good chance of not making it out alive. This river was fast, cold, and full of rocks and rapids. About 20 minutes in, we had our first full-blown crisis. Jen, my wife, came whipping around a corner, got caught sideways in some rapids, and flipped her kayak. I jumped out of my kayak, ran into the river, grabbed her and her kayak, and pulled her out to the side. We sat for about 5 minutes, and then finally Jen said, well, we better keep going while I'm still somewhat warm. So we got back in the kayaks and headed back out on the river. My wife totally should be an adventurer. Maybe she actually is. Okay, anyways, things continued on moving fast, and it wasn't long until we hit crisis number 2. Jen's kayak smashed up against a big rock in the middle of the river while waves attempted to break her in half. Yep, this is for sure another crisis. Again, my friend and I jumped out of our kayaks, got Jen off the rock, and immediately headed to shore. By this time, Jen was moving towards pretty much hypothermia, and it really didn't seem like we were going to be able to keep going. So I looked at my friend and asked, hey, what are we going to do? And turns out we had some flint, that's right, not matches, not a propane torch, flint, and decided to start a fire, which miraculously we were able to actually do. Then I looked at my friend and said, hey, listen, you need to head down the river and get the chopper, which he agreed to do. When I asked him how long it was going to take to get back, he really had no idea. You know, as he left us on the edge of the river with a fire and no idea how long we would be there, I have to admit, I wasn't sure exactly how this whole thing was going to turn out. The whole thing didn't seem wise. I knew we didn't have the strength to finish the trip, and in my weak moments, I wondered, man, does my friend even love me? Hey, why don't you spend some time and walk through these questions in your group? You know, when we find ourselves in these types of situations, when we're not in control, when things are not comfortable, when we feel threatened, one of our natural tendencies is to question the person that got us into the situation in the first place. And there are generally three types of questions we're asking. Number one is like, are you wise? Do you know what you're doing? Number two is like, is this good? Do you even care? Number three is, are we going to make it? Do we have the power to see it through? You know, these were the types of questions the Israelites were asking God after they left Egypt and found themselves wandering through the wilderness. Quick recap. This year we've been going through the story, and currently we are in the middle of the Israelites' journey from Egypt to the Promised Land. The Israelites, God's people, had become slaves to the Egyptians. They were treated terribly, and they cried out to God. And of course, God heard them, and he sent Moses and his brother Aaron to Egypt to lead his people out of the country and into a new land that he had promised them. Everyone was pretty excited when they were finally released from Egypt. I mean, who wouldn't be? But after a bit of time in the desert, when things started becoming uncomfortable, the Israelite people began to complain a lot. And not just complain. They began to question the goodness, the wisdom, and the power of God who had created them, saved them, and called them to a new way of living. We pick up their journey on page 72 of the story, or Numbers chapter 11 in your Bibles. Listen to what it says in Numbers chapter 11, 1-6. And the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled. And the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some of the outlying parts of the camp. Then the people cried out to Moses. And Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down. So the name of that place was called Taberah, because the fire of the Lord burned among them. Now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving, and the people of Israel also wept again and said, "Oh, that we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt that cost nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up, and there is nothing at all but this manna to look at." God had brought them out of slavery, and he was taking them to a new reality. In the meantime, they had to go through the desert, and it was hard. But every time they needed something, God supplied what they needed. They needed protection, he looked after them. They needed food, he gave them manna. But still, in the difficulty, they began to question the power, the wisdom, and the goodness of God. First, they questioned the power of God. Listen to what it says in Numbers 11, 13-15. "Where am I to get meat to give to all these people? For they weep before me and say, 'Give us meat that we may eat.' I am not able to carry all this people alone. The burden is too heavy for me. If you will treat me like this, kill me at once, if I find favor in your sight, that I may not see my wretchedness." So God responded to Moses, and he said he would give his people meat. And when Moses questioned if he actually had the power to do that, God responded by saying this, "Is the Lord's hand shortened? Now you shall see whether my word will come true for you or not." You know, the Bible often talks of God protecting his people with his right hand. It's a metaphor for God's power, his ability to look after them, to carry them, to see them through. And when Moses questions God, he is essentially asking God, "God, do you have the power to give us what we need?" Do you ever wonder if God has the power to give you what you need? You know, when I was in high school, my father died suddenly, and there were many times when I wondered if God was powerful enough to help me through the darkness I was in. And even though it was not easy, that would be an understatement, he absolutely did. He always does. Listen to me. God always has enough power to see us through. You see, as human beings, there are many things that limit us. Our lack of knowledge limits us. Our enemies limit us. Our lack of strength. Many things limit us, but nothing limits God. He is all-powerful, and he has shown us how powerful he is by what he did on the cross through Jesus Christ. You know, Jesus became a human being, died on the cross for our sin because of his love for us, and then 3 days later, he rose again. This is the gospel, or what we would call the good news. It is good news for us that even death was not more powerful than God. Did you hear that? Even death. You know, Paul, one of the authors in the New Testament, prayed that people would know how powerful God is and know that his power is for them, not against them. Listen to his prayer in Ephesians chapter 1, 16-20. "I do not cease to give thanks for you, remembering you in my prayers, that the God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of glory, may give you the spirit of wisdom and of revelation in the knowledge of him, having the eyes of your hearts enlightened, that you may know what is the hope to which he has called you, what are the riches of his glorious inheritance in the saints, and what is the immeasurable greatness of his power towards us who believe, according to the working of his great might, that he worked in Christ when he raised him from the dead and seated him at his right hand in the heavenly places. Hey, do you hear that? The same power that raised Jesus from the dead is the same power that is at work for us in the midst of our most difficult circumstances. We can have hope because God's power is for us, not against us. Hey, why don't you take a few minutes and just talk about that in your groups? Next the Israelites question God's wisdom. Numbers 12, 1-2 goes on, and it's Miriam and Aaron, and they're opposing Moses. And listen to what happens. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman who he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. And they said, "Has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also?" And the Lord heard it. God had chosen Moses to be the leader of the Israelites, and Miriam, his sister, and Aaron, his brother, to be second in command. And they didn't like it. They didn't trust God's choice and instead wanted to do things their way. I remember when Peyton was little and decided he wanted to run onto the highway. I thought it was wise that Peyton should choose not to run onto the highway. Imagine that. But he decided he knew better and made his way towards the road. Now, maybe it was because I was an adult who had a few more years under my belt, or simply the fact that I could see the cars driving up and down the road. But it was clear that Peyton's wisdom was not quite at the level of his parents. He thought he knew better, but he didn't. And if he were allowed to do his own thing, it was going to be a disaster. When Miriam and Aaron and the Israelite nation decided they knew better than God, it always turned out to be a disaster. And the truth is, that's the same for us. God is all-knowing. He is infinitely wiser than us. And even when things don't seem to be going the way they should, God always knows what he is doing. You know, the scriptures say that God knows the end from the beginning. There is nothing he doesn't know. And it shouldn't surprise us that we can't always understand his way or why he is calling us to do something or live a certain way. He is God and we are not. But when we trust his wisdom, in his time, he leads us to the place we need to be in the way we need to be there. God is wise. Now, finally, the Israelites question God's goodness. In Numbers 14, 1-4, it says this, "Then all the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night. And all the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, 'Would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness? Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become a prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt?' And they said to one another, 'Let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt.'" You know, the Israelites finally come to the land God had promised for them. It's amazing. But there are significant enemies living in the land, so relocating wasn't going to be super easy. It didn't seem safe. So the Israelites began to grumble against God. Essentially, they said God's way didn't feel good and God's way wasn't good. They wanted to go back to Egypt, the place that God had saved them from. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt like God was asking you to do something that didn't seem safe, that didn't seem good? You know, I remember when I was 16 and playing hockey in a men's league in the town I grew up in. And during the last game of the year, I hit an older, stronger, and significantly angrier player than I from the other team in the face with my stick. Now, needless to say, he didn't like it, and his response ended up putting me in the hospital. I remember a few weeks after that, people from our two towns started arguing in the newspaper over whose fault the fights were and who was to blame for the whole incident. I was sitting in church, a little later when I felt like God asked me to actually call the stranger, the older, stronger, angrier stranger, and apologize for the incident. I remember thinking, like, God, are you crazy? This doesn't seem safe, but I couldn't get away from it. And finally, I worked up the courage to randomly call the dude and apologize. And after I said sorry, the phone just went dead for like an uncomfortable amount of time. And finally, he said, "Is this a joke?" And after I explained to him that it was no joke, that I was in church and I felt like I needed to say sorry, it completely changed our conversation and the way we related to each other. It was incredible. I remember leaving that moment thinking, God is not safe, but he's good. He's always good. And the things he may call us to do might seem crazy, but ultimately they're good. Hey, I want you to take a little bit of time talking about the wisdom and goodness of God. There's a few questions that you guys can work through. So Jen and I were sitting on the bank on that river, and we were wondering exactly how long it would take for my friend to get back and rescue us. And to be honest, I really didn't doubt he was going to do it. This wasn't the first time my friend had helped people in tough situations. He had the means. I mean, dude owned a helicopter. How cool is that? And he really cared for people, including us. I knew I could trust him. And sure enough, it was about 2 hours later that we heard the sound of a helicopter coming down the canyon, and we were rescued. You know, adventures are super fun when you happen to have a helicopter. Unfortunately for the Israelites, they chose not to trust God, and instead they did their own thing, and the consequences were real and significant. A whole generation missed the promised land. But that didn't mean they missed out on relationship with God. You know, even though they sinned by not trusting him, he willingly forgave them when they repented and continued to lead them with power, wisdom, and love. You know, Numbers 14:18 to 19, near the end of the story, it says this: "The Lord is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgression, but he will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers to their children, to the third and fourth generation. Please pardon the iniquity of the people according to the greatness of your steadfast love, just as you have forgiven this people from Egypt until now." You know, God is the same with us. At some point, many points for most of us, we miss it when it comes to trusting God. But his incredible love invites us back into relationship when we confess our failures and turn back to trusting him. He is so good to us. Because Jesus died for us to forgive us, we can have relationship with the Father. Hey, maybe there's an area of your life that you have not been willing to trust God with. As long as you breathe, I want you to know that it is never too late to trust again, because God is always powerful, always wise, and always good.